Okay, right, well, welcome to this second of our Meet the Candidate debates, this time today for the Nelson electorate. This online event is jointly organised by Nelson Tasman Climate Forum and Forest and Bird, and we have a focus on climate change and biodiversity. It's being recorded now, and you'll be able to watch it later on YouTube as well, with a link from the Climate Forum website. This meeting is jointly chaired by myself, Chris Wheatley from the Climate Forum, and Scott Burnett from Forest and Bird of Nelson. And Scott will open the meeting now with a karakia. Thanks, Scott.
Good evening, everyone. Te karakia timatanga, tēnei te mihi kia rangi, tēnei te mihi kia papa, tēnei te mihi kia rawa tamariki, tēnei te mihi kia tāne. Mō te wehenga, mō te haora, mō ngā mātauranga, tihei, Māori ora. All right, I'm Scott Burnett. I'm the Regional Conservation Manager for Forest and Bird for the Top of the South. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'll hand over to the others to introduce themselves. Over to you, Chris.
Right, okay, so we'll give each candidate 1 minute to introduce themselves. So we have three candidates here this evening: Rachel Boyack, Blaire Cameron, and Jace Hobbs. Rachel for the Labour Party, Blaire for National, and Jace for the Greens. So we'll go in alphabetical order by family name first. So Rachel, would you like to go first? Thanks.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks to everyone for joining tonight, and a big thank you to you, Chris and Scott, and the Forum and Forest and Bird for hosting tonight's Meet the Candidates meeting on this very important issue. I'm really proud to be the Member of Parliament for Nelson and also to be a signatory to the Forum, and I do want to commend you for the work that you've done in our region, continuing to push on important issues related to climate change. I'm also really proud to be part of a government that has put the work in, and we'll be able to talk about some of that in a bit more detail tonight, and where we're starting to see the benefits and emissions dropping. But I do want to acknowledge there is a huge amount of work to do, and I'm also really proud of the climate manifesto that we've released this week that outlines a significant number of initiatives that the next Labour government will be introducing and continuing, so that we can continue that work and at the greater pace that we need. So thanks again for organising this important meeting. Climate change is the biggest issue for every generation, not just mine and those after me. It is the biggest issue that our globe faces, and I'm really keen to be part of this conversation tonight.
Thanks, Rachel. And Blaire, would you like to introduce yourself?
Kia ora koutou, ko Blaire Cameron tōku ingoa. I'm Blaire Cameron, the National Party candidate for Nelson. Thanks very much for organising this evening. So a bit about me. I grew up in a little town called Methven, down in the middle of the South Island, before getting a scholarship to go overseas, and then spent my career working for Princeton University, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund before coming home at the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm very proud to be the candidate in Nelson with the strongest environmental credentials. I spent a good portion of my early 20s working in the Amazon rainforest with Indigenous groups there on projects to protect the rainforest and develop their communities. And then in my career at Princeton University, I did a lot of work on sustainable supply chains, so certification systems like Rainforest Alliance, which saw me spend quite a bit of time on tea farms in Kenya and coffee farms in Colombia and in other parts of the world, working on efforts to improve environmental sustainability. So I'm very proud to be a member of the Blue Greens in the National Party, which is the group within the party that advises on environmental sustainability issues, climate change, biodiversity, etc. And I am really excited to talk about some of those policies with all of you tonight. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Blaire. That's really interesting. And Jace for the Green Party. Thanks.
Kia ora koutou. It is very nice to be here. I'm so proud of the green credentials and the progressive credentials that the Green Party has established for itself over the years. And all of the 16 years that I've been here, I have been very much of a Green Party supporter, and proud to be the spokesperson for that at this point. It really, I think we should preface this whole discussion by saying how critical this decade is. It's a critical election in a very critical decade for climate mitigation and adaptation. And I also want to say that while I really am going to hope to convince people that a party vote green is the right way to go, I'm actually not encouraging people to vote for me personally, because I think we have one standout person who's delivered for Nelson with the electric bus system and with the hospital, and that's Rachel Boyack. So as a candidate, I just want to make it clear that I'm hoping people will vote for Rachel. She's done a great job and will continue to do that. And so I'll talk more about the green initiatives and everything later in the discussion and the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Jace. Okay, so I'll just go ahead now and explain a bit about the format. First of all, the candidates who are here are all those who are standing in the Nelson electorate for parties that are polling over 5% nationally. We did invite the ACT candidate several times, but we have not had any response from ACT. So we have the three parties here this evening, three representatives. As we said before, the sort of main topics tonight are about the climate change, or the climate emergency, we can say, and the biodiversity crisis. And those two are intimately linked. It's really one joint crisis at the moment. We'll divide the evening into two parts. The first part, we have some questions that have been developed and selected by members of both the Climate Forum and Forest and Bird, and those have been sent in advance to the candidates. And so we'll go through several of those questions and allow each candidate 2 minutes to respond to each question. And then in the second half, we'll open up for questions from the rest of the audience, the participants here. If you could post your questions in the chat, and you can do that from now, and we'll review all the questions that are coming up, and Scott and I will moderate that and ask those. And again, candidates will get 2 minutes to respond, a maximum 2 minutes for each of those questions. Although if they want to, they can pass for some of those questions. Yeah, we ask you to please keep your questions brief and to the point, so we can get through as many as possible during this second half of the evening. In order to be fair, we'll be rotating the order in which the candidates ask the questions as well, so that they each get a chance to appear first. And we ask the candidates to stick to the question topics as well. All right. Okay. So, and anything else, Scott? I think that's the main...
No, I think that's great, Chris. If you're, I'll just hold up a 30-second thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's the other thing. So in order, so you know when 2 minutes is up, Scott's there with his 30-second sign. So that gives you a bit of warning that how the time's going. Right. Okay. So we'll alternate with the first set of questions, and I'll go first. So with the first question is that the IPCC says that in order to halve the chance of holding emissions below a 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase, we have to halve our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This means that we need to decrease year on year at a rate of about 9% each year. What will you do to make that happen? Okay, and since Rachel went first, now we'll go with Blaire. Blaire first. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. And look, we do have a climate crisis. I spent a good portion of time when I was younger volunteering for an NGO that worked to protect coral reefs. And if you haven't dived on a coral reef that's been bleached because of warming ocean temperatures, then it is a real eye-opener. It's like diving into a graveyard. And it just really exemplifies the crisis that we're in. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I'm going to be a very strong voice on climate change in the next government. And I've been advocating for policies like this through the Blue Greens Forum within the National Party since my time as a candidate. So, for example, we have a policy to double New Zealand's production of renewable energy through solar and wind. Those are areas that we really fall behind a lot of other countries on, and we really need to step up our game. It takes a lot longer in New Zealand to consent a wind farm, up to 8 years, and then another 2 years to build it compared to other countries. And so we are going to be changing our regulations to speed up that process so that we can double New Zealand's renewable electricity production. That is absolutely essential when we look at our transport fleet and we look at the shift we are making right now from fossil fuel powered vehicles to electric vehicles. And we absolutely need to ensure for the future that our transport fleet is powered by clean, renewable electricity. And as part of that, we will also be rolling out EV infrastructure across the country, 10,000 EV charging stations, which will help shift more people into giving up on their petrol and diesel powered vehicles and moving into EVs. That's absolutely essential across the South Island. I'm sure everyone that drives an EV here knows how the range anxiety creeps in when you're travelling to places like Christchurch or other parts of the South Island, where we really need to step up our EV infrastructure. We have lots of other policies to get our agricultural emissions down, to get industry emissions down, and also to get our transport emissions down. But I've already had the 30-second flag, so I should probably wrap up here.
Great. Thanks very much, Blair. Jace, would you like to go next?
Yes. So in the last 15 years, I've been speaking very widely about the issue of electric transportation and the necessary transition we have to make to that. I, of course, was the originator of a very large electric bike business, which I've retired from, but I'm still very much involved with that. I was a consultant to energy companies, and I think I know this issue about as well as anybody does. However, I also think that I'm pretty much supporting the Green Party plan, which is the only comprehensive plan we have had. And it has been arguing against Nationals backsliding on this for about 20 years now, and we are way behind the curve. So if we are going to meet the Paris Agreement, if we're going to satisfy our responsibility to next generations, we have to step up with a much bolder plan than any of the conservative administrations will do. And that is the primary thing. I won't go into all the details of that green plan right now, but I think we all know it's comprehensive, and it's really the one that leads the way in this. I just would also like to say that it's in this regard, it's important to steer the vote away from these conservative groups, which are calling spending on climate mitigation and adaptation. They're calling that wasteful spending, and we need to steer it to Rachel, because at least Rachel and the Labour Party has the clearest plans to support the things that the Greens have brought forward. And frankly, I think that they are leading. James Shaw has done more for climate in the last 5 years than all previous administrations had done in the previous 30 years. So I think that it's well established. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jace. Okay, and Rachel, your turn.
Thank you. There's no way I'm going to be able to get through everything in 2 minutes, so I will just point people to our climate manifesto, which is up on the Labour Party website. It is a really detailed document. It's got a number of amazing things in there. So I do just want to point out some of the things that we've done, and I do want to acknowledge the work of the Green Party, in particular James Shaw, who has been an excellent climate change minister, and long may he continue in that role. We have taken a number of steps, including passing the Zero Carbon Act, establishing the Climate Change Commission, and most importantly, in my view, starting the work around climate budgets within our annual government budget. That is critical to ensure that we're allocating the funds necessary through our annual budget towards climate change initiatives. One of the fabulous policies that we've started to see a real benefit of is what we call the Giddy Fund, which is where we are recycling funding from our heavy emitters back into partnering with them in order to decarbonise. So one of the most recent announcements was around Fonterra and the partnership work with Fonterra to support Fonterra to bring around their emissions earlier than originally planned. And what I would note is that opposition parties called that corporate welfare. Actually, it was money that came specifically from those emitters to help support them to do more. It did not come from the general taxation fund. So I just want to put that up front right now. There's a lot more work to do. We've recently announced our solar policy, where we will be supporting people to add solar panels to their homes, and continuing our work to partner with community solar projects. So I would just point you to the Climate Manifesto, because it's too big a question to answer in just 2 minutes.
Thanks very much, Rachel.
Right.
And I think that probably goes for all the parties and all the candidates to go and have a look at the websites and download and understand better the policies, because as you say, in 2 minutes, it's impossible to give that justice. Okay. Scott.
Right. Yeah, on to our next question. So Tasman Bay is severely degraded and sedimentation in the bay is a major problem. What will you or your party do to reduce sediment entering our region's waterways? And I think we're on to Jace first.
So sedimentation obviously is a land use problem, and of course the Greens have championed the best, protection of our streams and the lowest nitrate levels that will ensure that the streams don't nutrify to the point of being a danger to swim in and other bad conditions. But the urban planning is, and specifically forestry, is the key. Obviously, we need to ensure that riparian areas are planted and fenced off on streams so that the water can't run into those things. We need to defend the levels in streams are actually monitored, and the siltation levels are actually monitored to make sure that we have the upstream forestry practices are actually regulated. And we need to keep the greenhouse gas levels to a level that will ensure that the megastorms don't overwhelm us. Unfortunately, we are at the point of where we are going to get to a point of being overwhelmed by megastorms because we did not make the moves early enough. So at this point, we're in an adaptation issue, not necessarily a mitigation effort, and that's sad. But finally, we just need to make sure our pitiful forestry practices and urban planning are well-founded. And I think, the Green Party has always championed that wonderfully.
Thanks very much, Jace. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. There's two parts of this I want to point to in terms of my response. The first is around, Jace has already mentioned it, around the work around forestry. We all would have seen the devastation in the east coast of the North Island following the cyclone, and we actually had a mini version of that when we had the cyclones come through our region a couple of years ago, and it was mostly in the Tasman area. Yes, there was a bit of concern through the Nelson floods last year, but actually the devastation we saw in Tasman Bay came through those cyclones. Most people who are watching tonight will be aware of the inquiry that we put in place, particularly around land use and forestry practices following the cyclones. There are a number of things that we need to do better, one of which I think we need to do much better environmental monitoring around our forestry and land use practice to actually mitigate from ending up in that position in the first place. The second thing I'll just point to is around the work we're doing, particularly through Jobs for Nature, but other programs around planting. You would have seen a significant amount of planting pop up around our region over the last couple of years. I was at an event tonight around the work that we're doing to save the banded rail, and there is a lot of planting going on in that particular project. It's critical that we continue to fund through the different agencies that we fund those projects that that support planting that will help reduce the impact of sedimentation, but it's a huge issue for us. It's not the one that we can just solve overnight. But it needs to come through land use practice, but also the work that we're doing to actually repair.
Thanks, Rachel. Blaire.
Yeah, so we absolutely need to work with agriculture and forestry to make sure that we have continued improvement so that things don't get worse. I would note that the National Party it really strongly supports having a very good, strong water regulator in Te Mata Arawai. And I think that when we look at water quality issues, there's been a real lack of focus from this government on it. All the attention's gone on to creating this big three waters bureaucratic infrastructure that
Absolute bollocks.
isn't delivering for New Zealand at all.
And I'm on the committee that
we talk about the water regulator, then thanks for talking over me. If we talk, so National's a really strong supporter of the water regulator, and that will be continuing under our government when we implement local water done well, which is our replacement for Three Waters, which is also going to have a lot more, make sure that we have a lot more localized solutions to these local issues, because we won't be creating that overarching bureaucratic structure. We're actually going to be leaving it up to local authorities, but they're going to have to meet those strict water quality regulations. So that's what we'll be delivering in government.
Thanks, Blaire.
Right.
Back to you,
so
Chris.
now we'll go for the third question then, which is how will you prioritize free or low-cost passenger transport when walking and cycling over road spending? Road transport causes 16% of greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand, hundreds of deaths, community severance, air pollution, and biodiversity loss. Okay, so Rachel, this one for you first.
Obviously, this is my favourite topic. Having championed better public transport in Nelson for 15 years. When I moved here, I didn't drive and I'd only ever used public transport. And working with students at the Polytech, we identified we didn't have a good public transport system. And so over 15 years, I've been working with community groups and our two councils and many other people to get a better public transport system in place. I'm absolutely delighted that we now have a fantastic public transport system. I was down at our bus station in Nelson City today, and it was absolutely humming with buses coming in and out and people getting on the buses. I've been running street corner meetings around Nelson and also chatting to a lot of parents who put their kids on the bus. They're loving the fact that for our under 13s it is free. And they're loving the fact that it's giving their young people some independence. They're able to use their B card and start travelling around the city and planning their routes. So we're seeing this massive uptake of people using public transport. I've had people plea with me that we must keep free public transport for under 13s. It's making a huge difference for people who are putting their kids on a bus every day to and from school. It can save $1 a day, which is $5 a week. And if you've got 2 or 3 kids, that starts to add up pretty quickly. So I'm really proud of my record. The public transport system is going to improve again in the next couple of years. There'll be another doubling of frequency on those main routes. We will also have park and rides and more infrastructure come into play, and we'll eventually have those weekend services. So that's in the plan, the weekend services out to Wakefield and Motueka. So I'm incredibly proud of my record and having been able to work with the councils to deliver this for Nelson, and it's something I want to see get better and better as time goes on.
Thanks, Rachel. And Blaire, you next.
Yeah, I think the Nelson City Council and the Tasman District Council have done a really good job with the new public transport service, but it's only part of our transport infrastructure, right? We absolutely need good public transport. We need good cycleways. We need good spaces for pedestrians, and we need good roads too. So there's been a huge lack of investment in roading infrastructure under this government. Lots of planned developments have been cancelled. There's been a massive cut in the amount of money going into repairing potholes and taking care of our existing roading infrastructure. So we need to get the balance right. So we, as I said, absolutely great to have good public transport, absolutely essential. we need good cycleways, but we need to not neglect our roading infrastructure as well. And if you look at all the cities in the world that do have the best public transport and do have the best cycleways, I know I've lived in some of them, they also have good roads, and that's what we really lack here. And that's why I'm really happy that we've got funding secured, ready to go for the Hope bypass, which is going to be a 4-lane highway bypassing Richmond and Hope. It will mean, you know, you talk to the bus drivers here, and they're actually, one of the things they'll tell you is one of the things that they're worried about is that they get behind in their schedules because they get stuck between Nelson and Richmond at those Richmond lights. So I'm really excited about getting that underway when we get into government, and we'll absolutely be including a good cycleway along with that. And
if we look still building all the houses out there and not putting a transport plan in place.
Could you please just stop talking over me when it's my 2 minutes? When we look at the rest of our wider transport plan, we're going to have public transport investments in our big cities like Wellington and Auckland. And here I'm really excited to get that Hope bypass underway. Transport emissions are absolutely something that we need to be working on and getting down. Part of that is ensuring that we have those really good roads so that cars and trucks, etc., aren't getting being stationary for half their journeys or moving really slowly. As well, we want to be encouraging that modal shift, people moving onto bikes, moving into public transport as well. But we do need to provide the infrastructure that we need for our community, and that's what I'm looking forward to working on.
Can I just check if there's an opportunity to respond if inaccurate claims are made? Because National actually cut and flatlined road maintenance, and we've had to increase that significantly. So it's important that if things are put in, things are said that are actually inaccurate. And I sit on Parliament's Transport Committee. I've sit on Parliament's Transport Committee, and that's exactly what Waka Kotahi have advised us in their annual reviews. And I don't want to.
And Rachel, Waka Kotahi's own figures tell you that there's more potholes across New Zealand now than there ever has been.
Oh yeah, there's more potholes, but that's because you flatlined the funding. There's more potholes.
Okay.
That's why we're going to.
That's good. That's good. Thanks, guys. You were there. Jace, over to you. Thanks.
So I'm really glad that you used in this question the issue of public health, because that's vitally important to this. And 16% greenhouse emissions across New Zealand is actually not accurate for our local area, because if you take Richmond, Stoke, and Nelson, it's actually 93% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we put is from our automobiles. It's also a giant public health issue because, of course, we now know the statistics coming out of the health ministry that exhaust gases are very deleterious to public health. So we need to change for that reason as well. I actually helped write the 30-year plan for Auckland Council, which is now being operated upon. And if you look at the statistics that come out of the cities from around the world, which we studied as part of that Auckland submittal, you'll find that these communities never solve their problems by building more arterial roads to try to then once get ahead of traffic. It never, ever has worked. Look at the United States, look at Copenhagen, Amsterdam. They all had to escape from that model and go back into a intermodal model of transportation so they could finally get it to work. So what we need is just what Rachel has talked about. And frankly, I would really concur with her on that. And thank you so much for electric buses, Rachel. This is the kind of thing that will deliver us from a very difficult climate future, but also it will help our civic structure to have this kind of intermodal walking, biking amenities. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, Scott, for you now.
Yeah. So on to our next question. Many Nelson residents were impacted by last year's extreme weather event. How will you and or your party help Nelson adapt to our changing climate? And who's up this time? Is it Blaire? I think you first.
Blaire, yeah.
Sure. So obviously there was a lot of families in Nelson that were really severely impacted by the weather events from 13 months ago. And so I went around and visited a lot of them last month, and a lot of them felt really forgotten. They felt there was a huge amount of uncertainty, and they felt like they were in limbo because of the government's slow response on providing that certainty. It was especially disappointing when the government offered, temporary accommodation supplements and 50-50 buyout offers to communities in the North Island affected by Cyclone Gabrielle, but refused for a long time to do it here. And then finally, after we kicked up a bit of a fuss, they did come through on that. And it has been really disappointing that the government's climate adaptation plans, which they said they were going to have for us this year, they haven't made any progress on that, haven't delivered that. So what we do need to do is we need to develop that climate adaptation framework so that we can deal with these big weather events in the future. And we know that we are going to have more of them to deal with. We know that with climate change, these extreme weather events are going to become more frequent. And that's why it's vitally crucial that we have that national climate adaptation framework in place. That's what we're going to be crafting when we're in government, so that we have some certainty for the future, so that everybody knows when we have these events, what the response is going to be, what people are going to be entitled to, because actually that's the biggest thing that holds people back and causes that anxiety, is when these things happen and there's just ongoing uncertainty. And here in Nelson, that uncertainty happened for more than 12 months for a lot of those families affected. And I don't think that was fair. And I think we need to be doing a lot better than that.
Thanks very much, Blaire. Jace.
So we had a pretty brilliant response to the flooding disasters here, but to be clear, the flooding disasters here are flooding disasters everywhere. We're changing the whole region, the nation, the world. And it's not just great rainfall, it's also wind-driven high tides, which are threatening Lower Richmond, the Wood, Stoke itself, and that is the threat we're having. It's also land subsidence. We now know with the latest scientific research that certain areas of our community, but generally the whole community, is subsiding. And this coupled with sea level rise makes all of the areas like Monaco and Tahuna, they're very, very vulnerable. So we are going to have this, as Blaire says, we are going to have this. Unfortunately, it's because we did not deal with this when we could have, when it would have been easy. So now we're dealing with the effects of that. So the consequences are great, but welcome to our new world. I actually am a Red Cross volunteer, and I responded to all the floods in this region. And I can tell you that while the community, I think, felt well served by that, it is quite unfortunate, and we are not protected because the megastorms can overwhelm us. That is the unfortunate truth of it.
Thanks, Jace. Rachel.
Oh, thank you. Look, as well as the floods, which were devastating for Nelson, we've also had other significant events like the Pigeon Valley fires. And many of us are concerned leading into the summer that we're going to have a hot and windy summer. And I have been working with Fens and with the forestry owners around the work that they are doing to prepare. And so I do just want to place on record that we are going to be leading into a concerning time. I put equal weight on both adaptation, but also that we must continue mitigation. Climate change is happening now. We need to continue taking those steps. We can't just leave it all to adaptation. I do want to correct a couple of things that the national candidate has stated. The first is around buyouts, and what hasn't been covered through the media is that up until it would have been around July, I'd been advised by Nelson City Council that there were only going to be 1 to 2 buyouts needed. We had a couple of fantastic locals who I met with this week, who are wonderful people, who wrote to me and to the mayor and said, actually, we think there's going to be some challenges around our properties. And so we did some more investigation. And between the time that they came to see us and a lot of advocacy from both the mayor and I, and a lot of meetings with Grant Robertson, who sent his officials here, we managed to come up with a package for the buyouts for up to 14 people. And that has gone against, and we've seen this in the media, the official advice from council officials. And so I do just want to place on record that it has been a really difficult time for those families, but I think it's important that we, when these things happen, we work together and don't try and use them for point scoring, because I think any party who's in power wants to make sure that they are doing right by their communities. The last thing I just note is that, again, another inaccurate statement, we have released our first adaptation plan. There are a series of pieces within that then have more work. We've also put in place our $6 billion adaptation funding in this budget, which is being used to support communities, including some money here for Nelson, which will help with landslips. So there's more work to do in Nelson, where I'm keen to see us get some more support, and where both the Mayor and I are keen to keep advocating, particularly for better stormwater in parts of the areas that were affected by the floods.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, obviously adaptation and these buyouts, it's the sort of, I don't want to say the tip of the iceberg, but you know, it's going to be a big conversation for New Zealand over the coming decades, is how do we, you know, fund and support people in these transitions.
Exactly. And how do we develop a framework? Yeah, and that's the plan, is to have a proper framework in place so we're not having to make these up every time they happen.
Okay, is it Blaire's turn now? Or
no, I think Jace's turn.
Oh, Jace.
I think
I was last. I think we're on the
you were
next question.
Okay, right. So we're on to the next question then, are we? Right. I think I skipped something there then. Okay. So Jobs for Nature funding has helped us to make meaningful impacts on wilding pines and other pest weeds in the region. Do you think it's important to maintain this work, and how will you do so? And this is for Rachel first.
Thank you so much. Look, Jobs for Nature has been a fantastic program, and many people who are watching tonight will know where it came from. That came out of the COVID Response Fund, and it achieved two things. One was connecting people to employment, but also to ensure that we were putting forward support for environmental programs. That funding is through COVID officially coming to the end of its time in the next couple of years. And one of the things that we're doing is assessing the programs that we know we would like to see continue, and how we can continue to fund them either out of baseline operational funding from departments, or for other types of funding. So we know that it's a program that works, but we also are clear that it achieved what it needed to through COVID, and we won't be able to continue it at the same scale. It has been pretty disappointing in Parliament over the last couple of years to hear other parties call it wasteful spending. When I drive around or travel around the region, you see all the planting that's popping up, and you see the number of volunteers engaged in the amazing planting work, but also other jobs, like some of the work happening in a strategic way at the Brook Waimarama Sanctuary, that it's had a real impact on our region. So we need to continue funding what we can through the available funding that we have.
Blaire?
Yeah, I just want to use the first part of my question to just respond to what Rachel said about how I was only helping people for political point scoring, which isn't true. I got involved in that because I was approached by several of the families that felt completely forgotten by the government and were being stonewalled by the government, and needed somebody to call that out. So that they got the same offers that the North Island was offering. So that's why I got involved there. I was doing it on behalf of those families that approached me and asked me to. Going back to the question on Jobs for Nature, look, Jobs for Nature isn't something that I particularly support. I do think it has been, there's been a lot of spending there that hasn't been probably as efficient or effective as it has been. I absolutely support efforts to reduce wilding pines and other pests, etc. We haven't released our conservation policy yet, so I can't get into too much detail on things here, but I can tell you that I absolutely support efforts to stop the spread of wilding pines and other pests.
Jace?
Yes, I absolutely agree with what Rachel said. And rather than reiterate what she has said, I'm just going to make another point about Jobs for Nature and similar things. The changing climate and the necessity of protecting the biodiversity in this era is going to create a lot of very interesting entrepreneurial opportunities. And these jobs that are going to be created that are going to be required for our adaptation and things like that, that's also going to be quite good employment and necessary. So this is the kind of the cutting edge of the new development that we're going to have in an era of, unfortunately, climate chaos and catastrophe.
Right, and I just like to make the point as well that it's really important that the gains that have been made through Job for Nature are continued, that we don't, because those projects are finishing, that we don't go backwards and have reincursion of wilding pines into areas that have already been cleared because budgets are cut. So it's maintaining the gains we've made, I think, are really important. Right. So is that yeah, that's everybody's spoken on that topic? Yeah. Okay, you go now then, Scott.
Right. Yeah, and I just think it's a bigger piece around conservation or environmental planning, that we need funding that's over time so that it can sustain gains rather than short-term blips that get a quick win, but then we go backwards over time. This next question, it's a bit of a 3-in-1. So, will you commit to ending bottom trawling, doubling the number of wetlands, and increasing funding for a Jobs for Nature style scheme? Oceans, wetlands, and forests store carbon and play a key role in mitigating the impacts of extreme weather. And I think first up is, I've forgotten.
Blaire.
Blaire.
Sure. Yeah, as I talked about, I've spent a good amount of time in oceans and in forests, and absolutely want to recognise the key role they play in sequestering carbon and in supporting biodiversity. Wetlands in particular as well. So our agricultural policy recognises the important role wetlands play in sequestering carbon on farms. And I've been on farms where they've been doing awesome work creating wetlands that really both sequester carbon but also support biodiversity. We get all the birds coming back, and it's pretty awesome to watch. And there are lots of farmers that are taking those initiatives, but we need to recognise those efforts and get the incentives right. And so our agricultural emissions policy absolutely does that. We want to see more farmers taking those steps to improve their on-farm carbon emissions, and we will have on-farm plans by 2025 as part of our reducing agricultural emissions policy. As you all know, agricultural emissions in New Zealand are one of our highest emitting sectors, and so we do want to work with them, with farmers, to reduce their emissions. And that's really the key in Nationals policy, is that we're going to work with farmers to do that. So this government's had, they've had 6 years in government that have had several goes at trying to get agricultural emissions into the ETS, but they've really worked against farmers to do that. And that's why when we get into government, we want to have a partner with farmers, recognise what they're doing already, make sure they're getting recognition for that, make sure that we're getting the incentives right, so that we can see more wetlands on New Zealand.
So, Jace.
So it will surprise no one to realize that the Greens have been championing this issue now for decades. And we know very well how wetlands are vitally important to mitigating things like, floods. And that's what we've reduced those down to a very small percentile. We need to protect the ones that are there and reestablish those wetlands, which is going on in some places in New Zealand and very admirably. But we also need to remember that bottom trawling, I think, are one of the only 2 countries in the world that still allow bottom trawling here. And it's being supported by major corporations, which interestingly dump a lot of money into conservative administrations like our member here from National. So we are in a critical situation with this. And just to be clear, I was actually on the Greenpeace effort that painted the trawling ship with a slogan and got into the press about stopping the bottom trawling issue. It's a travesty. It's an atrocity. It is very unproductive in terms of fisheries, and it's not even very productive in terms of money making. But it's one of those sort of like white horse things that's been being protected here by the industries, and we need to stop that kind of a thing. That's the kind of industry that is very involved in the selection. It's the kind of industry we need to protect ourselves for, and it's one of the reasons we need to put Rachel back in office.
And over to Rachel.
So obviously, yes, there are three parts to this question, and I do just want to focus mostly on the oceans and fisheries part. Most people will be aware that we are going to ban bottom trawling in the bulk of the Hauraki Gulf. But one of the things I wanted to point out is the amount of work occurring in the oceans and fisheries sector to diversify that sector and to improve the technology in that sector. And I want to commend particularly the local work being led by the NRDA, by iwi, by some of our large companies and by our councils to establish an organisation called Moana Nui, which is around growing our oceans and fisheries sector, but in a way that is adding value. As the local MP, I have the privilege of sitting on the board of Cawthron, and one of the things that is occurring throughout our region is a real focus on microalgae and on how we can add value and get value from our oceans in a way that grows high quality, high skilled jobs, but that doesn't cause damage to our oceans. And so we have a huge opportunity to make a step change here in Nelson. So our government's funded through my advocacy $500,000 into that Moana Nui project. We've funded a couple of $1 million into Snap IT, who do amazing work around cameras on boats, and they're doing further work to work with agriculture around their IT in terms of being able to scan and support herds of cows through their program called HerdX. So one of the things we have an opportunity to do here in Nelson is to look at how we can change the way that these industries are operating, grow better jobs, and also protect our environment more, because we can actually make that massive step change here in Nelson.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Yeah. So, Scott, do you think we move on to the questions from coming in through the chat now? Yeah. Okay. So I'll go with the first one, which is about the the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity. Okay. So this is a recently launched policy statement. And do you consider it sufficient to stop the decline in New Zealand's biodiversity, especially considering the effects of climate change? Okay, and
Jace, I think you're up first.
Jace first for this. Yeah. You're muted, Jace.
Sorry, my unmute button didn't work just then. Well, I think we can judge the actions of past administrations by what they actually did rather than what they're saying now. And I think it's very clear that the reason we have the biodiversity problem we have is because of the conservative past administrations, which have neglected this issue, have neglected the the whole issue, of course, of sedimentation and nitration of the streams and the well-being of public health even in that issue. So to protect the industries like that, as to the extent, to the sort of the opposition of public health and the public welfare, is a little bit, I think, a little disingenuous now to come out and say how strongly they support it. It's really, that's not the case. We know that the Greens have been around forever, banning mining on public lands, banning trawling on, advocating for the banning of trawling on seamounts, the monitoring the sedimentation of our streams and nearshore habitats, the conversion to zero emission vehicles, the revising forestry practices to do those very things, and invasive species reductions. So I think I do not need to speak to the choir here to sort of say the Greens have been very strong on all of these issues.
Thanks, Jace. Okay, Rachel, over to you.
Thank you. It's a great question. And what I would say is that when we make national policy statements of any kind, there will always be people who think we've gone too far and people that we haven't gone far enough. And that's part of the role of government, is to ensure that we're constantly assessing and updating the policy statements that we have in place. One of the key parts to the national policy statement around Indigenous biodiversity is actually the important role that we have as a partnership with iwi Māori. And that's something I do want to take the opportunity to put on record tonight, is the importance that we as a government place on partnership with iwi Māori, with mana whenua, around land use, around biodiversity, around water use, and around the protection of our natural resources. It's an important component of ensuring that we have appropriate stewardship, kaitiakitanga, over our natural resources, and also to continue to improve our biodiversity outcomes in New Zealand. There's no doubt that we have lost far too much of our native bush, of our native birds, and of all of our native species. And working in partnership with iwi Māori is an important part of how we move forward. I look at an organisation like the Brook Waimarama Sanctuary and doing a remarkable job partnering with Ngāi Tahu to bring a diverse species like the Kakariki Karaka that the Minister and I went and spoke to them about earlier this year, back into the Brook. That is around a partnership with iwi Māori, and it allows that governance and that stewardship from mana whenua to be part of the important work that we're doing to protect our native species. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And Blaire?
Yeah, just wanted to push back a wee bit on Jace's words there about how the Green Party are the forefront of all of these things, because I think there's been a real lack of practical solutions from their party, and even just on example off the top of my head, their push while they were in government a few years ago to ban anything to do with biotechnology and GMOs, etc., which has meant that now New Zealand is way behind the curve on developing those technologies and trialing those technologies, when actually they're going to play a really important part in getting our methane emissions down in the future. That's something that we're really looking to embrace, and using those technologies to get our greenhouse gas emissions down. And so we really just need those sort of practical solutions. And I'm really absolutely going to be somebody that's really pushing for those practical solutions in government. If you want a representative here that is going to be really strong on climate change, really strong on biodiversity, then please consider giving me your vote. I have that track record. I've spent a huge amount of time in the Amazon working with Indigenous groups there on efforts to stop conversion to palm oil plantations, to stop oil exploration, to protect their rainforest, to protect their biodiversity, to develop sustainable economic development through ecotourism and things like that. And I'm absolutely in government, I'm going to be someone that really encourages the government to take further steps on promoting biodiversity of our native species in New Zealand.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, Scott, for the next question.
Yeah, so we're going to jump around a little bit within the questions to keep it interesting. So my question, what action will you or your party take to reduce resource waste? So the person also asked what happened to the proposed container deposit scheme. And Rachel, I think you're up first.
Sure. So I'll respond first on the container deposit scheme, and I think that question's probably come from Karen Driver, and I just want to acknowledge her and her advocacy around that. So you'll be aware that we haven't. I want to be really clear that we haven't actually stopped the work on the container deposit scheme. We've parked it. But we absolutely intend to continue down that piece of work. One of the things that the Prime Minister did at the beginning of the year was to do an assessment across multiple projects to ensure that our public service was able to focus better, because there'll be no secret to a lot of you that we have a very large work program, and we did need to take some care around actually how much work we were loading up on our public servants. And so I want to be really clear that the container deposit scheme is not on the chopping block completely. It was just put in a parked state, and there is every intent for us to continue that work in our next term of government. It's a really important scheme, and the biggest challenge was actually setting the price at the right price point, and working with those who produce the containers themselves to ensure that we're getting the right price point, so that actually the scheme itself can make a difference. So it's something that I have spoken to locals about, and I know that there is a real keenness for us to continue that project. I was on the board of the Nelson Environment Centre for 3 years, so I just pushed back a bit on the suggestion I don't have strong economic credentials. I was part of the group that had oversight of Nelson's Kai Rescue program, and I do want to acknowledge the work that NEC have been doing in areas like Kai Rescue, but also the fantastic work we've been doing in e-waste. We have a fantastic e-waste scheme where people are able to take in products that need to be recycled, with support from both central government and our two councils. Thanks.
Okay. Blaire next, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fundamental reason why that scheme didn't get going, and it's the same as the reason that a lot of things didn't going in this government, and it's because there's been that fundamental inability to deliver. And I think not everyone in New Zealand has seen that across government. They've had lots of ideas that they've dreamed up, but translating them into results on the ground has been something that has not occurred across the board. So there's anything to reduce waste is something that I'm supportive of. I've spoken with the Nelson Environment Centre, Anton there, and absolutely supportive of their e-waste program and other efforts across our community, like Kai Rescue, where I was supporting the Tahununu Community Hub to deliver some of Kai Rescue food the other week, and we'll continue to be supportive of those efforts across the Nelson community if I get the opportunity to be the MP for Nelson.
Thanks. And Jace?
So the reason that we are here in this issue when I'm not having very adequate plastic reduction and bottle deposits and things like that is the resistance of business and its efforts through the national government to keep those things from happening. And it's good to know that Blaire is such a green-hearted person, but really his party is anything but that. And now the national program is build more roads, and Blaire, of course, is advocating building bypasses of the wrong move in our area for all the reasons we've talked about. You never reduce wastage by continuing to build roads. The carbon embedded in the building of the road is huge. The covering of agricultural land to build the road is deplorable. And then the results afterwards is people just drive more. So I just would say, you have to look at the credentials of these parties. And, that's really the point I think that I want to make. Otherwise, I just applaud what Rachel said about those issues.
Right. Okay. So I'll move on to the next question, which is, okay, we urgently need good leadership in climate action. What have you done personally to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in your own life space? And Blaire, first, we'll start out with you.
Sure. Well, I don't want to be one of those smug EV drivers that gloats about being an EV driver to everyone, but I do drive an EV. And have done for a while, and absolutely support that transition to electric vehicles. I'm also a big runner and walker, so quite usually if it's something within running and walking distance, then I'll just jog down to the beach or jog into town as well to make sure there's another car off the road. Absolutely, like everyone, embrace recycling and other efforts to reduce emissions. I am a meat eater, so I haven't taken that vegetarian plunge yet. I do recognise that does reduce emissions as well. But as I talked about, environmental issues have always been a passion of mine from when I was a teenager, and would go out diving on coral reefs, monitoring reef health for different environmental groups, and also when I was in my early 20s, when I did spend a significant amount of time working in the Amazon with groups there on their efforts to protect the forest. So I guess I'll leave it there. I think I do have pretty solid credentials in this area, and absolutely support others taking those steps too.
Thanks. Okay. Jace, next, for your personal.
Really, I always find it a little humorous when candidates always, when they talk about, the environmental well-being that they're promoting, and they say, well, I walk and I cycle twice a week to work and I compost and things like that. We're well past the era that little individual actions are going to ameliorate or reduce in any significant way the global climate problem that we have. We're in an era, like you say, of needing broad leadership, not this, platitudes of sort of like, if everyone would just, ride their bike a little bit more, that's good, but it's not going to deliver us from this real massive problem. I have spoken widely over the years, everywhere in New Zealand, transportation conferences and everywhere, about this issue of carbon neutral transportation model. I spoke recently at the Nelson Science Society, and that is something that I've done a great for. Of course, I ran an electric bike business for 12 years and sold thousands and thousands of electric bikes, and arguably am the granddaddy of the electric bike era in New Zealand. So, I mean, personally, I can rest on those advocacy issues, but really we are now in a period where we need policy initiatives, we need broad governmental leadership, and frankly, we're going to get that only with a Labor Greens coalition. Go, Rachel, with your electric buses. Wonderful.
So it's my turn. I'm going to just say something a little bit similar to Jace, which is that I've always strongly held the view that in order to both protect the environment and also mitigate and respond to climate change, it needs to happen at every level. It needs to happen at the individual level, at the community level, at a business level, and at a government level. And so I do push back when I sometimes hear from people that it's all about what each individual does in terms of their choices. Actually, what's most significant is the work that government does to support people to make better choices. For example, here in Nelson, the biggest, whenever I surveyed people and whenever the council surveyed people, the biggest pushback on using a bus was the frequency of the service. And so that's why both local and central government have invested in more frequency of buses, because that was the biggest barrier. It wasn't about the individual choices people were making. It was actually about government enabling people to make better choices. But in terms of my personal work around climate change, I have an electric bike. I didn't actually drive until I moved to Nelson. So I grew up biking and walking and using the bus, and those are my preferred forms of transport. And so I do want to give a shout out to Jace for the work he's done around bringing electric bikes to New Zealand, but also people like Frank Witowski, who make wonderful award-winning electric bikes, and I'm really proud to own one of his bikes. The other thing as well is it's about waste reduction. So rather than recycling, it's, in my view, actually about limiting the waste in the first place. Our government has taken steps to do things like ban plastic bags, and we're banning plastic straws and other forms of containers that actually don't need to be used in the first place. So that's actually got to be the critical goal. Rather than relying on recycling, we need to make sure that the products that we're using in terms of product stewardship are actually not going to create waste in the first place.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Okay, Scott, the next question for you.
Yeah, I'm going to paraphrase this one a little bit. The person asking says the climate breakdown and biodiversity loss are the major issues facing us long term. However, there are many other issues that feel more immediate for New Zealanders, like right now, like the cost of living crisis. When people are struggling to survive, they have less energy and appetite for climate action. And I guess this question is about just transitions. How do you support a just transition so that we're bringing everybody along with us, and so that our adaptation to a changing climate feels fair and inclusive. And Jace, you're up first.
So biodiversity and the rising cost of living are not separate issues. I mean, on the one, obvious hand is that insurance rates go up, but also food prices go up because we have food insecurity, and we're going to have climate refugees, that all from having to come into New Zealand, which initially costs us something. Actually, refugees ultimately do contribute wonderfully to our nation, but initially we're going to have these kinds of issues. It's not a single it's not just a factor of biodiversity versus the economy. They are linked, as you would know, and climate chaos and biodiversity are inextricably linked. These are things that are, part of the same issue, basically, and we will suffer more probably from biodiversity loss ultimately than even from weather catastrophes. So I guess my point would be, don't try to disentangle those two things. They're part of the same thing. That's why the necessity of responding to them becomes ever greater, ever more important. That is the mantra of the Green Party. And we've known that for about 30 years, while conservative administrations were doubting the existence of climate change, were doubting the existence of the science around climate change. Then they finally could be, oh, there is climate change. Oh, now we have a climate chaos, but we really won't fund it because it's expensive, it's wasteful spending. So we're going to trump up a sort of like a little model argument to throw crumbs out. But what we're talking about is ineffectual leadership from them. Let's convert that to a Greens Labour coalition.
Thanks, Jace. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks. It's a great question. In one of my previous roles, working as a union organiser, working on issues to do with just transition was an important part of our work. And this is an area where our government is putting specific resource, because with our decision to end offshore oil drilling in Taranaki, there is a genuine challenge there for that community about what a just transition looks like. And so that is why we have actively set up a project with that community, with the community at the heart of it, so that we can identify new industries and new job opportunities. It's a real issue. And if I look at the West Coast as an example, one of the challenges we often face on the coast is that when we do make decisions around industries that are changing or finishing, it does have a bigger issue, an economic impact. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. But also that we have to have action around it, which is why there has also been a lot of investment into the West Coast and in other parts of New Zealand. So it's something that we don't actually hear a lot of other political parties talk about, is that need for a just transition. It's really important that we don't shy away from making the change we need to make, because ultimately it's also our poorer communities who face the biggest impact of climate change. And in our region, I point to the Pacific. We know that our Pacific neighbours are at huge risk economically from the impacts of climate change. And it's one of the reasons why, as a government, we have been investing in climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies into the Pacific. They are our neighbours, they are our family, and it's important that we support them through their challenges. And I think it's really, really important that when we are talking about these issues, that we don't shy away from the fact that for many people, when cost of living is such a difficult issue, that considering things around climate change aren't top of mind. But it's why, for example, it's so critical we keep free and cheap public transport in this region, because it is making a real difference for the back pockets of locals and also making a difference around climate change.
Thanks, Rachel.
So I'm going to look a little bit closer to home than the Pacific, because at the moment, right now in Nelson, we have thousands of families that are really struggling with the cost of living crisis. We have families that aren't able to get groceries every week. We have families that can't pay their rent. Even families that have done all the right things, worked hard, saved up to get deposit on a house, and now have moved into their own homes, who are now struggling to pay those mortgages because their interest rate's gone from just over 2% to over 7%. It is absolutely essential that when the next government, that fixing the cost of living crisis is absolutely top of mind. And I know from going and from speaking to so many of these people that it feels, they feel completely left out and ignored by the government when they increase huge amounts of spending on things that aren't making a difference to people here locally, and really aren't helping them get out of this crisis and to live. And I've been getting a lot of criticism from the people that talk about National getting rid of the clean car discount, and for me, this was just an unfair policy in the first place. I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago, came up to me and said, I heard that you guys are going to be getting rid of the clean car discount. When's that going to be happening? I've bought 2 Teslas and I want to get a third one before that clean car discount goes. And when you look at that from a perspective of a person here in Nelson and thinking, I'm struggling to get by and the government is subsidising somebody who's going to buy extra Teslas for their family, that's not fair. So we need really practical solutions, and the environment and the economy are absolutely linked, right? We can't have a great economy without having a really strong and healthy environment. But equally, we can't make a lot of those investments in the environment that we want to unless we have a strong and growing economy. And we absolutely need to be taking everyone with us. The cost of living is the #1 issue in Nelson at the moment when you go around talking to people. And that's why it needs to be the biggest focus of the next government, so that then we can make those investments in promoting biodiversity and in climate change mitigation and adaptation.
Thanks, Blaire.
Thanks, Blaire. So I'll go for the next question. Okay, climate change is a long-term challenge, but political terms are short. We've got a 3-year term here in New Zealand, right? How will you ensure that climate policies remain a priority for future administrations and that progress is sustained over time? And I think, Rachel, you're up first with this one.
Oh, thank you for the question. This is why it's so important that we keep the legislation in place. And, I have real concerns, particularly around the ACT Party's approach to climate change. And even hearing today that, that Christopher Luxon's preference is to have a deal with ACT, where they want to actually roll back a lot of that legislation. It's critical that we continue to have climate emission budgets in every single budget. It needs to be part of business as usual at government, rather than something that just comes along in the whim of a political cycle. So I am really concerned at the potential for that legislation to be walked back or undermined. And what I can assure people of is that the Labour Party is committed to continuing with all of our climate legislation that we have in place, and those annual climate budgets, so that we continue to make the investment we need at a government level. I will just push back a little bit on the previous comments around where we're spending our money, because actually a lot of the programs that we're putting in place are actually to help people on low and middle incomes. And I look particularly and point to issues around public transport. Here in Nelson, it's making a huge difference. And I also want to push back around the clean car discount. The biggest benefit from that program is that it will ultimately, and is already beginning, to create a second-hand electric vehicle market. And so what that does is it opens up opportunities for people on lower and middle incomes to buy a second-hand electric vehicle. And that's how we create an electric vehicle fleet for everyone. And that ultimately will save those families a lot of money in terms of fuel they would be putting into their vehicles. So there is actually a systematic and structural change that we're making here, and that is why it's important we keep that clean car discount in place.
Thanks, Rachel. Blaire?
Sure. So just wanted to push back a little bit on that then. When you you talk to people about what's holding them back from getting an EV, a lot of them will tell you it's that range anxiety, because you have people that will get an EV, but they'll keep their petrol vehicle just because there aren't enough charging stations across the South Island. So that's why it's absolutely critical that we invest in that EV infrastructure, and National will deliver 10,000 EV charging stations across the country. Look, I'm campaigning for the National Party to get a stronger party vote as possible, because the National Party is 100% committed to meeting our climate change, 2050 climate and 2030 and 2050 climate change goals. We support the Zero Carbon Act. In fact, a lot of our MPs worked with James Shaw on that act, and I'm absolutely a huge supporter of efforts to make sure that we meet our climate change goals. As a huge number of MPs in the National Party, when the Blue Green started, it was started by Nick Smith back in the 1990s when I was about 7 or 8 years old. It was just him and one other National Party MP. And then when we had our Blue Greens conference this year, it was 14 MPs. It was a bunch of new candidates like me, and it was also Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon. They are 100% committed to making sure that we do meet our climate change goals, and that we are a really strong party for the environment, but also a practical party for the environment. We're really campaigning on really practical solutions that are going to drive emissions down, that are going to support us meeting those goals in the future. And if you're looking for a really strong person on the environment in the next government, then I'm asking for your vote. Thanks.
Okay, Jace.
So there is a very common narrative around conservative political parties that we really can't afford many of these programs, but I would like to push back on that. We are a wealthy nation. We have plenty of wealth within this nation if we didn't have a very unequitable and unfair tax system. Right now, the very uber wealthy among us pays about half the tax rate that a nurse pays. For instance, if you're in the top 2 or 3% of New Zealanders, you probably pay about 8.9% in taxes, while a nurse making 67,000 or 70,000 pays 20%. And the loopholes have to do, of course, with around the issues of capital gains not being taxed and not having a wealth tax. And we're the only country, I believe, in the OECD that does not have some form of a capital gains tax or a wealth tax. And of course, those ultra wealthy people dump millions and millions of dollars into conservative parties that want to protect that special privilege. But we need to turn this around. And if we do turn it around, we can afford to pay doctors and nurses and teachers and public service workers and all those issues. We can afford to transition into a zero waste economy. We can afford to transition into a transportation model which isn't just a gift to fossil fuel enterprises. We can afford those things, but we need the political will. That's why we can't allow a continuation of these ultra-conservative parties to fund the campaigns that are really counterproductive to the great majority of New Zealanders.
Thanks, Jace. Maybe one more question, Scott, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. So the final question, why do ratepayers and taxpayers have to cover the cost of removing wilding pines? Surely it should be the forestry industry. And I think, Blaire, you're up first. Oh, you're on mute, Blaire.
Sorry, yeah, just as I mentioned before, I can't get too much into our policy in this area because it hasn't been released yet. But absolutely support the removing of wilding pines and other pests. That's all from me.
Jace.
So the people who are really paying for the lack of accountability to these major agrarian and forestry industries are the people who lost their homes in these floods. The people of Hawke's Bay who are now, looking at a much changed landscape. The people in Christchurch who have blue babies or just nitrate levels that are exceeding the safe drinking water standards. So all of these things, of course, means that industries that are making, are producing the pollution need to be accountable for the pollution. And that is something that has been protected, unfortunately, by past conservative administrations. They've unhinged the actual attribution of the costs of industries with the problems, and the public has had to pay for the problems while the industries got off scot-free. That's what we need to change. We can change that during this election, this administration cycle.
Thanks, Jace. Rachel.
So look, I've got no issue with requiring industry to have to deal with the impact of wilding pines. They are particularly frustrating in our region, but also sometimes we do need to have to be pragmatic. Sometimes you can't necessarily point to where exactly the wilding pines have come from because they've spread so far, and when they are the issue that they are, sometimes the pragmatism in terms of putting funding in to actually get rid of the things, that is where we've put funding in, because they're such a problem, they're such a pest that sometimes that pragmatism is needed. And I do want to acknowledge my colleague, Damien O'Connor, who's really led the charge on this in our caucus. He has a particular displeasure around wilding pines. And so I get the frustration sometimes using taxpayer money for this, but sometimes it's the pragmatic thing to do because it is such an issue and we do need to make that change and get rid of those things.
But Damien's still not managed to secure the funding that the Wilding Pine Network want to continue the work they're doing, has he?
You'll need to ask him that one.
Okay, I think we might actually have time for one more question, because that was quite a quick round there. Okay, so how would candidates suggest we measure the success of the governing party over the next term when it comes to climate and biodiversity? What would success look like? Maybe a quick answer from everyone. And Blair, would you like to go first?
Look, I've been really disappointed by this government's progress on climate change.
Look forward. How would you measure success for the next 3 years?
Yeah, and I will do a lot better than what this government does. That's what I want to see. I want to see things heading in the right direction again. I want to see really strong efforts on climate change and biodiversity. More progress on agricultural emissions in particular, and also getting transport emissions down. Those are our biggest ones that we need to work on. And yeah, as I've said, Christopher Luxon, Nicola Willis, and our whole team are absolutely committed to doing that, and I look forward to working with them in government on making progress on those issues.
Thanks, Jace.
So, all of the issues that we kind of touched on tonight and the obvious problems are the ones that we need to measure the next government by. I mean, seabed degradation, the forestry practices that threaten us, the adaptation to the new climate chaos era, the mitigation efforts we can take, the reduction of plastics, the protection of wildlife and biodiversity. These are all things that we obviously have, measured results for. We can actually take them to account. And if a Labour Greens government did not deliver on those things, then we could be talking about at that point. But I think you'll find that we are the best ones poised to actually deliver on all the necessary programs and policies that we need to carry us into the next 3 to 4 years.
Thanks, Jace. Rachel?
It's simple for me. We want to see emissions continue to go down. That is the measure of success that we're looking for, and we need to continue it at pace. The concerns that we've got around some of National's policies in particular would actually lead to higher pricing in areas like fuel when they're removing funding in areas like the Giddy Fund. And so, I just encourage people to read through the policies and actually take real care around what will actually deliver results and is already delivering results versus climate change policies that will actually lead to consumers paying higher prices and emissions not falling as fast as we need them to.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone. We did, Scott, we did offer in the chat for candidates to respond to any comments by other candidates that they think were incorrect. Would any of you like to take up that opportunity? Just a very quick sort of comeback on things that, a few things that you think might have been incorrect.
Yeah, so I just wanted to push back on the statement there that our climate change policy will result in higher prices for consumers. That's not the case. In fact, all of our policy is really designed around the cost of living crisis and getting the cost of living down at the same time as we make progress on our climate change efforts. There's one thing that I did want to point out as well, and that's our focus has to be on getting domestic emissions down through transport, through agriculture, through our highest emitters. We can't rely on overseas to do this. We absolutely need to be leading the charge ourselves. And I'm really looking forward to being in a government that's going to deliver on that and really deliver on that with practical solutions in a practical way. This isn't a debate between the environment or the economy. We can really drive both forward. We can have economic growth and deliver on environmental solutions at the same time if we're practical.
Okay, thanks. Rachel, anything you'd like to say to close off?
Yeah. Yes, there was something I wanted to particularly push back on earlier, which was around transport funding. So I have the privilege of sitting on the Transport Select Committee, and one of the issues that occurred under the previous government was that we saw an increase in the percentage of state highway networks in New Zealand, and we had a flatlining of funding towards road maintenance. And so we built up a massive backlog of road maintenance, and we sweated that asset for far too long. There's no doubt that also through COVID and through weather events that has added delays in the maintenance that we need to do. And it's one of the reasons why in the next government policy statement on transport, we have a huge increase in road maintenance, because it is important that we have good quality roads, because that does actually ensure that we can transport ourselves and our goods around without things like potholes that actually slow things down and then actually lead to greater emissions. So it is important that we have good quality roads. I also just want to note that the Hope Bypass project doesn't necessarily mean, I know National wants to see a 4-lane Hope Bypass. I want to just note that actually none of that design has been finalised. And what's critical about that project is that it doesn't accidentally cause induced demand. The reason we're having to put that project in place is that we had urban sprawl out in Richmond, and we have a really unsafe situation at the moment with trucks and with pedestrians operating in the same area, and we need to change that. But from my point of view, I wouldn't want to say it definitely is going to be 4 lanes, because I think that I have more faith in our transport planners to be able to put together a solution that isn't going to lead to a lot more vehicles on the road, because we don't want to see that as a result of the project out in Lower Queen Street. Just the last thing I'd say is that if we really care about the cost of living, then I think the beneficiary bashing we've seen today for our lowest and most vulnerable people today is something that causes me deep distress. We want people on our lowest incomes to have the support that they need so that they can focus on things like climate change.
Okay, so I'll pass on to let's give Jace a chance to come back on any points he wants to cover quickly.
Yes, well said, Rachel. I just would like to reiterate a statement, which is this is a really critical election. It's a really critical decade. For climate issues and for other biodiversity issues and even social issues, we don't get second chances with this. We're either going to do this now or we are going to fail at it. So we have to be very careful about who gets forward in this election. And that's why I've shifted my concern about getting any votes at all, because I really, really have to be sort of insistent that we have a win for the climate in this era. The other and road building of things like that are really the wrong move. But I also want to reiterate one further thing, which is we are a wealthy nation. We can afford this. If we have a fair and equitable tax system, we can do wonders with the problems that we have, and we can lead the world like we have in other areas. Now, in closing, I would like to give the closing karakia. So I've got a great karakia I would enjoy giving. So if that can be possible, I enjoy doing it.
Am I allowed to respond to Rachel's point, please? Look,
Very quick, Blair.
Yeah, I just wanted to push back on her characterization of that. Look, I grew up with a working mum. I know how important it is for kids to grow up in families who, when their parents work, if they can, and that's what our policy is designed around. It's designed around helping people that are on the benefit get back to work and getting those incentives right, so that we do get people back to work. It is a crazy situation right now that we have low unemployment, yet we have close to record numbers of people on the job seeker benefit, and our policy is really designed around changing that situation, helping people get back to work. It's going to be good for their families and it's going to be good for New Zealand. What our cost of living plan is designed around is about giving people more in their back pocket, and so everyone in Nelson will end up with more money in their back pocket through National's tax relief plan that they can then choose to spend on public transport if they want.
$2 a week for a part-time minimum wage
whatever
worker.
they want to spend
$2 a week.
Spend their money on.
$2 a
Yes,
week.
I think it's time for the closing karakia. If we could do that.
$2 a week for minimum wage.
Thanks. Jace, please.
Hang on, just before you start, Jace, I'd just like to say a big thank you to all the candidates for coming out and engaging in this debate. Thank you very much. And a big thank you also to all the Nelson residents who've turned out tonight to share this conversation with us. Thanks, Jace. Oh,
thank you for the opportunity.
And one more thing, this video is going to be uploaded on YouTube and shared via Nelson Tasman Climate Forum and Forest and Bird in the coming days. Jace.
Thanks for the opportunity. So just as a closing karakia, I would like to quote one of the giants of sort of American indigenous culture, and that's Chief Seattle. And his quote was, and it meant a lot to me as a young man, I quote, "What we do to the earth, we do to ourselves," unquote. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jace. Thank you, Rachel, Blair, and Jace, and thanks everybody for being here this evening. Yeah. Bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us. Really good. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Chris.
Yeah. Okay.